Hello, this video will discuss the preface to a book called Djamila Boupacha by Simone de Beauvoir. The book was originally published in French in 1962, has been translated into English, but is out of print currently for reasons that I'll leave you to speculate on after we discuss the contents of the article. I do want to give a bit of a content warning before you get too far into this video. The video will discuss torture as well as sexual assault and rape. So just be aware that those subjects will come up throughout the video. Okay, so Djamila Boupacha was a 23-year-old agent for the FLN during the Algerian War, in which Algeria saw independence from France. And the FLN was a militant organization that engaged in both political struggle and also a sort of violent military insurrection against the French state in Algeria. And I think it's fair to say that the general goal of the FLN is to drive the French out of Algeria. The tension between the French philosophers that we're interested in here, Sartre, Beauvoir, and Albert Camus, are exacerbated by the political lines that get drawn in Algeria. Camus was what was called a pied noir, which is or a black foot. So he was born in Algeria, but he was French. Now Camus grew up in extreme poverty. His mother was an invalid who really could not work. His father was killed in World War I at the Battle of the Marne when Camus was very young. And so Camus feels, or rightly or wrongly, a connection to Algeria as his home. And so Camus is going to advocate for a way in which there can be peace established between the Arabs in Algeria and other indigenous Algerians and the French, particularly French that were born in Algeria. Sartre and Beauvoir side basically with the FLN and with the Algerians and think that France should leave. Beauvoir will say very clearly, they want us out and we should go. The other major fault line between these thinkers is on the use of terrorism as a political strategy. Sartre and Beauvoir support, with Frantz Fanon, the use of violent insurrection against colonial powers. Camus is against the use of this kind of violence by ostensibly liberation movements. Camus is famous for a remark he made to a member of the FLN when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is discussing the use of terroristic strategies by the FLN. Camus says something to the effect of, you place bombs on the metro and in cafes, my mother could be on that train. If that's justice, I prefer my mother. So Camus there is making a very qualified statement that if these violent strategies are justice, I basically don't want anything to do with justice. Now, obviously, Camus is a great advocate for justice and for a peaceful solution to the crises in Algeria. So this statement by Camus, I think, is very widely misinterpreted and misunderstood. It's really a statement against the violent political tactics that the FLN made that were indiscriminate in their targets. If you put a bomb in a cafe or in a metro, you're not just targeting military personnel or something like that, or combatants, or however you want to construe it, but you're doing damage to the civilian population. In his book, The Rebel, Camus talks a lot about responsible violence. And he particularly points us to some of the Russian nihilists who carried out assassination plots against the Tsar in Russia and against Russian political targets, but were very careful and wrote at length about making sure that no civilian casualties arose, and even abandoning assassination plots when the target was surrounded by their family and that kind of thing. So don't truck a bomb into the family carriage or something like that, right? So Camus thinks that political violence has to be not just a last resort, but carried out in a very judicious and pointed way against targets that are sort of directly involved. Whereas for Sartre and Beauvoir, some of the activities by groups like the FLN are justified given the context that they're in. And Beauvoir herself felt very guilty about her role, what she perceived as her role in perpetuating French colonialism. Her and Sartre would go to Algeria and vacation there in the 40s, and she wrote sort of pastoral passages praising the beauty of the Algerian countryside and so on and so forth. And when the political reality of the situation became more clear to her, she felt very guilty for her indulgences in using Algerian land for her own kind of pleasure and benefit and so on. And so she's driven both by the plight of the Algerian people, the desperation of their circumstances that commit them to violent insurrection, as well as her own role. The average French citizen doesn't get off the hook in the eyes of Sartre and Beauvoir for the role that they play in perpetuating and maintaining a system of colonial exploitation and violence against the indigenous population and Arab population of Algeria. So the version of Beauvoir's preface to Djamila Boupacha is again in the political writings text by University of Illinois. Again, this is I can't recommend strongly enough this series of Beauvoir's writings with Margaret Simons as the general editor there. So a very good collection, and that collection of political writings is significant and brings into English translation for the first time a lot of Beauvoir's political engagements. So Djamila Boupacha was involved with the FLN. She was arrested and tortured. She was sexually assaulted with a bottle. She was beaten, burned with cigarettes, all kinds of things to that effect. And this was part of a system of torture and violence waged against Algeria by France. Beginning in 1835, with the pacification of Algeria, France brutally subjugated Algeria. Between 1835 and I think 1875, there were 825,000 Algerian deaths. So the pacification of Algeria was brutal. The regime in France was racist against Algerians. There are all kinds of awful racist statements made about the Algerian population, that their villages are burned, they're destroying everything that crawls at our feet like dogs, is the statement of one of the French colonels in the 19th century about Algeria. The pacification of Algeria has been studied as a genocide against the population of Algeria, particularly by Ben Kiernan. A book out by Yale University Press, Blood and Soil, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur. In that book you can see, for instance, instances of whole tribes being wiped out by the French, 500 men, women, and children of the El Ufia tribe were killed in one night. 500 to 700 members of the Uled Ria tribe killed by suffocation in a cave. Those sorts of awful, violent methods to suppress the population. Djamila Boupacha's case, one of the things that makes it important in Beauvoir's eyes is that it actually gets reported. That through a series of events, this case actually makes it into the press and becomes widely reported on. And Beauvoir plays a role in bringing this case of Djamila Boupacha to the public consciousness, and trying, to do within her role as a public intellectual and writer, to expose the system of torture that had been implemented. The real sort of credit for the reporting and the writing of the book, Djamila Boupacha, goes to Gisele Halimi. And Gisele Halimi had been contacted by the family of Djamila Boupacha to bring some of this treatment to light. And through a series of sort of fortuitous events, fortuitous only under a certain aspect, right? The whole the case of Djamila Boupacha really helps to bring this whole system into relief. Beauvoir begins the preface by just providing a litany of violent acts carried out during the opening days of the Algerian War. During the course of the last few months, the press, including even the most circumspect papers, has been full of horror stories, assassinations, lynchings, violent racist attacks on Arab immigrants, manhunts in the streets of Oran, corpses by the dozens in Paris, hanging from trees in the Bois Boulogne and along the banks of the Seine. So she's trying to speak somewhat soberly to a ever-growing list of sort of horror stories coming out of the war, both on the side of the French and, on the side of the Algerians. She lists the All Saints' Day massacre, La Toussaint Rouge, which began the Algerian War on November 1st, 1954. So she says, in telling the story, Gisele Halimi does not claim to stir the hearts of those who remain impervious to shame if they are not already submerged in it. The major interest of her book, and here's the point I was just speaking to, is that it exposes piece by piece a mechanism of lies that fit together so perfectly that even after 7 years, only a few glimpses of truth get through. How many times have I come up against this response? But if it were really so widespread, so enormous, and so horrible, it would be common knowledge. But that's exactly it, Beauvoir goes on. In order to be so widespread, so enormous, and so horrible, the very fact that it is must be kept secret. The use of torture has been publicly advocated by General Massu, openly taught to young officers, sanctioned by a large number of clerics, applauded by the European population of Algeria, and systematically practiced in the triage centers, she says in quotes, prisons, military bases, and jebels, so it has been easy to deny torture in each particular case, thanks to this unanimity. So one of the important reasons, I think, to read this particular preface by Beauvoir, and really the book, Halimi's book, broadly, is because of the parallels that we see today with the torture program run by the United States in its ostensive war on terror. I'm going to point out several points of comparison and analogies that resonate between the French use of torture against the Algerians and the United States' use of torture against suspects in the war on terror from various places across the Middle East. So, again, this is not a problem that has gone away or remains isolated to Algeria in the middle of the 20th century, but is a general political and philosophical problem, and a real I mean, that's the least of it, right? It's not just an intellectual game for the people who are engaged in and suffering under these regimes, right? So it's something that philosophy can give us some tools to wrap our heads around and understand, but that's kind of like the last, the least of our concerns when we deal with issues like this. When she talks about it being so widespread, it's not just that the military is torturing people, but it's getting, again, support systematically from doctors and psychologists. The doctor who examined Boupacha after she had been tortured and sexually assaulted with a bottle didn't spend any time with her. He did not examine her, he did not give her a vaginal or a gynecological examination. He attributed the bleeding that she was having due to her trauma from being sexual assaulted to basically menstruation. And so co-signing these events with medical professionals and so on gave this like an air of legitimacy. Again, the United States, you can look at psychologists like James Elmer Mitchell and John Bruce Jessen, who designed and helped to implement the enhanced interrogation techniques that included waterboarding, which is also a technique that was used by the French military in Algeria. There was an ethic complaint filed against Mitchell in Texas in 2010 because he violated the oath that psychologists take to do no harm when he helped to design and implement enhanced interrogation. The American Civil Liberties Union filed a suit, and also in 2015, as more details of the psychologists' involvement in the enhanced interrogation program and rendition program became more exposed and widely known. You also have instances where, you know, lower level people are maybe called out. They're like the bad apples that have ruined the bunch. But Beauvoir is keen to show that this is a sort of systematic problem. So you have this kind of collusion. Beauvoir is also drawing attention to the sort of widespread disappearances of people. This is much like how folks from the Middle East are rendered to black sites at Guantanamo Bay or in other locations around the world, that they are just disappeared and no one knows. The most high-profile instance of this in Algeria was the young mathematician Aden. Maurice Aden was disappeared in 1957. He was a professor of math at the University of Algiers. He was arrested, tortured, and killed. It was confirmed later that, in fact, he had been disappeared by the French military and was killed. Beauvoir is accusing, or is clear that she believes Aden was assassinated and killed after or during torture by the French military. She is right. It was not confirmed. The French government and the military denied it for many years. But just in 2018, I believe in September, Macron admitted that it did. In Macron's own words, at that time, it was reported that the French president said he, quote, recognized in the name of the French Republic that Maurice Aden was tortured and then executed or tortured to death by soldiers who arrested him at his home. So this is an example of just an academic and a dissident who was murdered by the French authorities in Algeria at the time. She also mentions, after the spectacular suicide, in scare quotes, of Boumengel, several voices were raised and were insistent, but were also in vain. It was also revealed Boumengel was thrown from a rooftop, and his death made to look like a suicide by members of the French military. Boumengel was a member of the FLN, and he was involved, along with Jacques Verres, with helping to provide legal counsel. So many Algerians were going on trial during the war, but it was very difficult to get them a good defense lawyer because they were hated by the French populace and by the professional class of France. And so the lawyers who would step up to provide these people with defense were targeted and harassed both by members of the public and also by French officials in the military, as this staged suicide, the murder of Ali Boumengel, really shows. And again, this was admitted that this is exactly what happened. So Beauvoir is making claims and accusations that at the time were not being admitted to or confirmed by French authorities, but we now know this is exactly what happened. It's been admitted and confirmed even as recently as 2018 that these people have been disappeared and were subject to a torture regime that led to their death. She then goes on to outline how the interrogations are covered over, how there's help from the doctors to justify what is going on, and the dangers that Djamila Boupacha really faced once she had been captured and was subject to this kind of interrogation. She says Djamila was very nearly condemned, like so many others, based on a forced confession under torture, since no proof against her was upheld. The awful days in El Biar and Hussein Dey would have only existed in her memory. An unexpected event changed the classic scenario. A letter sent from the camp, from Camp Boussouet, written by Djamila's brother, reached Gisele Halimi. Lawyers who come from France to defend Algerians are rare. As I was just articulating, you can see some of the consequences for lawyers who did this. And in spite of their zeal, they can take on a very limited number of cases. So the first goal was to get Boupacha some legal representation that could press her case against the French authorities. And it kind of lucked out that they were able to do that. A committee was created to support Djamila, so there was some public support by intellectuals in France, including Beauvoir and others. It caused such an uproar in France and abroad that on June 17th, the court, which ordinarily would not have balked at condemning the young woman without her lawyer present, feared that such a step would provoke a serious outrage, so they decided to postpone the trial. Not long after that, they offered her a deal. A psychiatrist would declare that she was not responsible for her actions, and she would be acquitted. But at the same time, her accusations would lose all credit. The trial against her torturers would not take place. She refused. So Boupacha was accused of, and perhaps credibly accused of helping the FLN to plant bombs during the Battle of Algiers. But there was no evidence against her. She did not hide her affiliation with the FLN, but there was nothing except this forced confession under torture that actually tied her to these crimes against the French state during the Algerian struggle for independence. If she submitted herself to the psychological review, which said that she was not responsible for her actions, that would also then discredit her testimony against the regime of torture. So of course she refused that. She wasn't going to take like an insanity plea or anything like that and thereby discredit herself on this other matter of a regime of torture that is being exposed in a really robust way because of the attention given to her case in particular. Beauvoir here, I think the committee that causes this public outrage, I think, is an important element of Beauvoir's own activities in the political sphere, that through public pressure, through exposure, through writing about it, through propagandizing and publishing, there can be pressure applied to authorities through public opinion to change certain practices. And I think Beauvoir, from her position, views this as one of her responsibilities as a writer, to so agitate for this kind of change and pressure through public opinion to be applied to powers within France. Right. So that's a role that Beauvoir views herself as being responsible for, in part, along with other people with whom she worked on such committees. And she meets with the Patin. This is in an interview who he was Matan, I forget his exact, a commission for the protection of individual rights and freedoms was led by this Mr. Patin, and Beauvoir met with these kinds of public officials in order to pressure them to do the right thing and de-escalate or dismantle these torture regimes. For Beauvoir, there's a line with political violence where, on the one hand, if you're poor and destitute and you're being brutalized by an oppressive regime that is denying you all kinds of opportunities, that is making you work under starvation wages, that has taken your land, that has pushed you into a position where you can't grow food, all of the good agricultural area has been taken over and handed over to the French, and so on and so forth. Look, your options are getting pretty slim, short of a violent political insurrection. There's no excuse for a country as powerful as France to institute torture. If France wants to claim any kind of moral high ground, while it condemns the FLN for their violent activities, it can't torture people. One ought not torture people, generally speaking, but in the case of a powerful country like France or the United States, it's particularly egregious and offensive, morally and ethically, to Beauvoir that they would seek to justify this type of activity and behavior. Right? So she doesn't think that there is a moral high ground, but of course, she was struck in this interview with Mr. Patin, again, who's heading up this Commission for the Protection of Individual Rights and Freedoms, that he was a racist, that he was devoted to the army, he was racist, and he was afraid. And so how can you do this job to try to ensure individual rights and freedoms if you're denying the humanity of people against whom you're racist, and you're defending the power in the army that oppresses them, and then you're fearful, and you're driven by emotions of fear and that kind of thing. So she says that Patin spoke with a certain amount of candor, that he didn't really seem to doubt that Djamila and her father had in fact been tortured. And as he led us to the door of his office, he said to me personally, quote, "This canker in our midst comes from Nazism. It penetrates everywhere, corrupts everything, and we are unable to curb it. A bit of roughing up is fair enough. You can't run a police force without that, but torture is something different." So making excuses for police violence, a bit of roughing up, there, but then tries to make a moral distinction between that kind of violence and torture, which he says is something different. Unacceptable. I try to make them understand and tell them that there's a line that shouldn't be crossed. And he shrugged his shoulders, Beauvoir says then, and he shrugged his shoulders in a confession of ineffectiveness and complicity. There, Beauvoir is not going to let any of these people off the hook, herself included. She feels guilty for the role that she played in as a citizen of France in the oppression of Algeria. It's a canker in our midst, he repeated. That's what Beauvoir reports. And she's astonished by it. She says, "I would not have dared to credit any fictional character with the views he expressed to us. One of his gestures in particular struck me. One of us, Germain Tillion, I think, observed that the number of massacred civilian Muslims is significantly greater than that of European victims, and that no punishment had ever been publicly ordered for their murderers. He waved his hand toward a huge pile of reports. I know, he said, I know. He could not have acknowledged more explicitly that, far from protecting anything, as is in the title of his commission that he heads up, he was covering up everything." So, again, there are two levels of philosophical and ethical importance here. One is to seek justice in the particular case of Djamila Boupacha. That is probably the penultimate concern here. But one of the significant things about this individual case is the way that it exposes the greater system of torture. So again, you have that existentialist emphasis on the individual and the system in which they're embedded. So of course, Boupacha deserves justice in her own right, but her case is also significant for the way that it reveals this greater injustice against the whole, greater in the sense of bigger, not in the sense of being more important, against the whole population of Algeria, the whole Arab population of Algeria. And again, because they're faced with this kind of violent regime, it's one of the reasons why Beauvoir and Sartre support the FLN even when they are violent, right? So even when they're violent, right? She says, as it moves through trial, the judge accumulates charges and proofs. The report had reconstructed the crimes committed against Djamila. The only thing left was to serve the indictment and hear the accused. As early as February 1961, he made a request to the commander of Algiers Sahel for the list of police and military personnel who had been in contact with Djamila, her father, her brother-in-law. He renewed his request on March 8th, asking for the names of military personnel, officers, non-commissioned officers, gendarmes, and privates, and civilian police officers who participated in the operation that took place the night of February 10 and the early morning of February 11th at the Boupacha household. So again, you see particular people who are given up, for instance, like Lindy England in the case of the Abu Ghraib torture photographs. Without those photographs, again, that activity at places like Abu Ghraib in Iraq during the American waged war there would never have come to light. And if these people, if Lindy England and Charles Grainer had not been photographed together with some of these prisoners, some of that would have never have come to light. And again, part of it is to seek justice for the particular people that are harmed, but also to reveal the sort of system. By the way, Lindy England is from Fort Ashby, West Virginia, not very far from where I grew up. I had friends that went to Frankfurt High School, where Lindy England went to high school. And so it's not just faceless people from nowhere. It is, people participating in these regimes who are outside of that context, for all intents and purposes, just average, ordinary citizens who get put into these situations and then commit horrible atrocities against defenseless prisoners of war for the sake of some ideological goal or commitment or something like that. And again, this is part of the reason why Beauvoir is holding herself and other average French citizens responsible. It's from those that population that the ranks of the military are fleshed out. These are the people committing these atrocities. They're not drawn from some source outside of France. They're the sons and daughters of the country who are serving in the military that are committing these acts. And so you can't blame it. This whole Nazism line in Patin's response is kind of a deflection. Yes, there were French citizens who collaborated with the Nazis and who had fascistic sympathies. And now, in the name of France, they're committing atrocities against the population of the colonized. But that doesn't mean that they're not responsible, or that they're not part of France, or that they're not acting in the national interests of France in the colonies. So what's the point of this Nazi comparison if not to deflect and make it seem as though, oh, it's not something that's really authentically part of the French system or something like that. That these are outliers. Oh, well, some of them are bad. Yeah, sure, there's one or two bad apples. But no, I mean, it's proven that in Algeria and other places, this kind of stuff is coming down from the top, that there are high-ranking military officials involved in these programs that admit, for instance, to the murder of some of these activists and lawyers and so on. So, again, Beauvoir and Sartre, coming out of that existentialist ethic, are going to side almost always with the oppressed. And this is something they actually share, I think, in common with Camus, that the person who's under the boot is going to get their sympathy. Because if you're in a position of power and you have your foot on somebody's neck, you're using your freedom to deny the freedom of others. And the material conditions for Algerians and the Arab population of Algeria and the indigenous population in Algeria was made so dire that they had no opportunity to actualize their potentials. They were made illiterate, and we'll discuss that more with Sartre's piece that colonialism is a system. They were capped off of the sort of best land. They were working bare subsistent wages. We'll look more at the system of colonialism and the effects it has on the population, but people who are in that situation are going to get the existentialist sympathy because they are the ones who's having their freedom denied by the other. That's what oppression is, when one group uses their freedom to deny freedom to another. And clearly, I think Beauvoir sees that that's exactly what's going on in Algeria and had been going on there since 1830, 1835. So she's always going to be sympathetic to that type of liberation movement in a way. So I think I'll leave this video here, and we will pick up this thread as we move into the Frantz Fanon book. So I will continue this discussion a bit with Jean-Paul Sartre, Colonialism as a System, and then we'll look at his preface to The Wretched of the Earth, The Wretched of the Earth being a book by Frantz Fanon, one of his two very famous books, and then we'll move into Black Skin, White Masks, and discuss this from the perspective actually of Frantz Fanon, who is a Caribbean author from Martinique that went to Algeria to fight with the FLN in the Algerian liberation movement, and whose arguments and justification for the use of violence in political struggle we'll look closely at, and which won over Sartre at the end of the day. And Beauvoir was greatly influenced by that as well. Okay, so moving ahead into the political and ethical implications of existentialism as a philosophical system, we'll continue to look at the political position of the existentialist relative to the anti-colonialist movement against France and within France in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, thanks.